From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The cell, better the box, was cooled down to the point that I was shaking most of the time. For the next 70 days, I wouldn't know the sweetness of sleeping. Interrogation 24 hours a day. I was living literally in terror.
Guantanamo Diary. It's just been published to rave reviews. Sales are brisk. What's shocking? It's a new book about rendition, torture, and imprisonment without charge, written by a man still locked up after 12 years at Guantanamo. Today, the story of Mohamedou Ould-Slahi. We'll hear excerpts of his prison diary and speak to his attorney, Nancy Hollander.
There's no reason for Mohamedou to be in Guantanamo. Mohamedou has never been charged with a crime. He's been in Guantanamo now 14 years. It's not that they haven't found the evidence against him. There isn't any evidence against him.
We'll also speak to Larry Siems, who edited the prison diary, and Colonel Morris Davis, the former chief military prosecutor at Guantanamo. He knew Mohamedou Ould-Slahi and says he's no more a terrorist than Forrest Gump. Then halfway around the world, a massive hunger strike is underway at what some are calling the Guantanamo Bay of the Pacific. It's taking place at an offshore detention center housing men and women seeking asylum in Australia. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Justice Department is poised to announce it will not bring civil rights charges against Ferguson, Missouri police officer Darren Wilson for shooting unarmed African-American teenager Michael Brown. The New York Times reports Attorney General Eric Holder will have the final say, but will almost certainly side with investigators who are recommending no charges. A wider Justice Department probe into Ferguson police over reports of racial profiling in traffic stops and use of excessive force remains underway. Meanwhile, a judge has rejected an NAACP Legal Defense Fund request for a new grand jury to consider criminal charges against Darren Wilson. The group raised concerns over the actions of prosecutor Bob McCullough, including his decision to let a witness provide false testimony. Newly released video from a police dashboard camera shows officers in New Jersey shot and killed an African-American man who had his hands in the air. The video from December 30th shows police officers Brahim Days and Roger Worley pulling over a car. After apparently removing a gun from the car's glove compartment, Officer Days warns the passenger, Jerame Reed, not to move, saying, quote, "I'm going to shoot you, and if you reach for something, you're going to be, expletive, dead." Reed appears to say, "I'm getting out and I'm getting on the ground," before standing up with both hands raised in apparent surrender. Both police officers then open fire, shooting at least 6 times.
You reach for something, you're going to be dead. I'm telling you. I'm telling you. Keep your hands right there. Hey, Jerome, you reach for something, you're going to be dead. He's reaching. He's reaching. Show me your hands. No. No, you're not. No, you're not. No, you're not. Don't move.
Both Bridgeton, New Jersey police officers have been placed on paid leave amidst a probe. In eastern Ukraine, a mortar blast on board a bus has killed up to 13 people in the pro-Russian rebel stronghold of Donetsk. Each side in the conflict has accused the other. The bombing comes after Ukrainian forces announced they'd surrendered the Donetsk airport to the rebels. In Yemen, Shiite Houthi rebels have reportedly reached a deal to retreat from key positions, including the president's home, in return for increased political power. But witnesses say the rebels still surround the residence of U.S.-backed President Abdurabu Mansour Hadi. The head of Germany's anti-Islam Pegida movement has stepped down after a controversy over a photo that showed him posing as Adolf Hitler. Lutz Bachmann had also come under fire for his messages on social media referring to immigrants as scumbags and trash. Newly unveiled documents show an elaborate plot between Argentina and Iran to shield Iranian officials accused in a 1994 bombing in exchange for Iranian oil. The transcripts of secret communications are part of the probe by prosecutor Alberto Nisman, who was found dead of a gunshot wound Sunday, hours before he was due to testify on his findings. Officials have called his death a suicide amidst initial claims his apartment was locked from inside. But a locksmith who was called to the scene says the service door was easily opened, and there are reports of a third entrance through a neighboring apartment. In what the White House has called a departure from diplomatic protocol, Republican House Speaker John Boehner has invited Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address a joint session of Congress on Iran. Boehner's announcement comes one day after President Obama vowed in his State of the Union address to veto any new sanctions on Iran. Boehner acknowledged he did not tell the White House before inviting Netanyahu.
I did not consult with the White House. The Congress can make this decision on its own. I don't believe I'm poking anyone in the eye. There is a serious threat that exists in the world. And the president last night kind of papered over it. And the fact is that there needs to be a more serious conversation in America about how serious the threat is from radical Islamic jihadists and the threat posed by Iran.
Protesters interrupted a Supreme Court hearing Wednesday to mark the 5th anniversary of the court's decision in Citizens United, which opened the floodgates for unlimited political spending. 7 people were arrested after rising to their feet one by one, shouting, "Overturn Citizens United," and "One person, one vote." House Republicans have dropped plans to vote today on a bill to ban abortion after 20 weeks, following dissent from women within the Republican Party. Republican leaders plan to vote on the measure today on the 42nd anniversary of Roe v. Wade, but women lawmakers reportedly raised concerns in closed-door talks, particularly over a requirement that rape and incest survivors seeking an exemption to the ban report to police first. Half of the U.S. Senate has refused to formally acknowledge the existence of man-made climate change. 49 Republicans voted against a measure, noting human activity significantly contributes to climate change. The Senate overwhelmingly did approve a resolution acknowledging that climate change is not a hoax. Just one person voted against it, Mississippi Republican Senator Roger Wicker. In North Dakota, nearly 3 million gallons of salt water created as a byproduct of oil drilling have leaked from a pipeline. According to the Associated Press, the spill is the largest since the state's oil boom began and nearly 3 times worse than the previous record. This comes after up to 50,000 gallons of oil spilled into the Yellowstone River in eastern Montana, where residents of Glendive and the surrounding area have been told not to drink their water. The new Republican chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee has asked the Obama administration to return all copies of the Senate's landmark report on CIA torture. Senator Richard Burr has indicated he will return a secret CIA internal report known as the Panetta Review, which found the agency inflated the importance of information gained through torture. The commanding officer in charge of the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay has been fired due to a, quote, loss of confidence in his ability to command. Unnamed officials told the AP Captain John Nettleton is under investigation in connection with the mysterious death of a man whose wife Nettleton was having an affair with. And the New York Times is reporting New York State Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver will be arrested today on charges of corruption. Silver has been Speaker for over 20 years. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. After a 7-year legal battle, the diary of a prisoner held at Guantanamo Bay has just been published and has become a surprise bestseller. The diary was written by a Mauritanian man named Mohamedou Ould Slahi, who has been held at the base for more than 12 years. He was ordered released in 2010, but is still being held. Later in the show, we'll be joined by his lawyer, Nancy Hollander, and Larry Seams, who edited the diary.
But first, let's turn to a new video produced by The Guardian. It features interviews with Nancy Hollander, Seams, and Mohamedou Ould Slahi's brother, Yateh. It begins with the actor Dominic West, best known for his role as Detective Jimmy McNulty in the TV show The Wire, reading the diary writings of Mohamedou Ould-Slahi.
The cell, better the box, was cooled down to the point that I was shaking most of the time. For the next 70 days, I wouldn't know the sweetness of sleeping. Interrogation 24 hours a day. I was living literally in terror.
There's no reason for Mohamedou to be in Guantanamo. Mohamedou has never been charged with a crime. He's been in Guantanamo now 14 years. It's not that they haven't found the evidence against him. There isn't any evidence against him. Mohamedou started writing in 2005. He had prepared 90 pages in a notebook that the guards had given him. That was the beginning of this manuscript.
For a number of years, his attorneys conduct litigation and negotiations to get that manuscript declassified.
Mohamedou is somewhat of a modern Renaissance man. He is from the country of Mauritania. He's from a very poor family, but he won a scholarship to study in Germany as a very young man.
Mohamedou had joined al-Qaeda in the early 1990s. Like many young men, he had gone to Afghanistan as a student to join the fight against the communist government of Afghanistan. And to join the fight, you had to train at an al-Qaeda camp, and he had trained and he had sworn loyalty to them. But as he's said repeatedly, he broke all ties after the communist government collapsed and the various Mujahideen factions started shooting each other. Mohamedou essentially said, "I'm out."
Mohamedou was at his mother's house in November of 2001, and he gets a call from the police to come and be interviewed. And he literally, I'm sure, told his mother, "I'll be right back." And he disappeared, and his family has never seen him again to this day.
There were 4 of them when I stepped outside the door with my mum and my aunt. Both kept their eyes staring at me. It is the taste of helplessness when you see your beloved fading away like a dream, and you cannot help him.
He realized he wasn't going home when he got on an airplane, was stripped of his clothes. In August of 2002, he landed in Cuba, in Guantanamo. His family, of course, had no idea what had happened to him.
And it was only when Yadi, Mohamedou's younger brother, who lives in Germany, picked up Der Spiegel and saw an article in October of 2002 that Mohamedou was in Guantanamo, did the family know where he had been held.
We were all speechless. How can a government lie to us for so long and play such dirty games with us? We were all completely disheartened.
They were trying to frighten him so that he would tell them what they wanted to hear.
They would come to him essentially and say, "Well, we know what you did. We just need you to tell us.
We know you were involved in 9/11. We know you know these people."
And they were on this kind of endless fishing expedition.
And there was no truth to tell them. But that's what they kept saying.
I'm going to do everything I'm allowed to break you. You'll never see your family again. My answer was always, do what you got to do. I have done nothing. And as soon as I spit my words, he went wildly crazy, as if he wanted to devour me alive.
Mohamedou was subjected to a whole list of torture techniques that had been approved by the Secretary of Defense.
They told him they had taken my mother from Mauritania and put her in a single cell in Guantanamo. And if he didn't give officials the information they expected, she would be severely tortured.
Significantly, they included what in Guantanamo was known as the frequent flyer program. And they called it that because they wouldn't let people sleep, and they proceeded to torture him.
Blindfold the if he tries to look. One of them hit me hard across the face and quickly put the goggles on my eyes, earmuffs on my ears, and a small bag over my head. They tightened the chains around my ankles and my wrists. Afterwards, I started to bleed. I thought they were going to execute me.
Just as Mohamedou had this remarkable journey, his manuscript has a fairly remarkable journey. He writes it in 2005.
We would get the book in bits and pieces.
He started the book as a diary, and over the years, the book became more detailed.
Every utterance of a Guantanamo prisoner is deemed classified from the moment of its creation.
What you have to do is send it back to what's called a privilege team, and they read it and decide what can be made unclassified.
What I got in the summer of 2012 was the version of the manuscript that was cleared for public release, that had had these, layers of censorship grafted onto it. The physical impression of a page full of redactions is a brick wall. The amazing thing about Mohamedou and his writing is he has an incredibly strong, clear voice.
They brought me a chessboard so I could play against myself. When the guards noticed my chessboard, they all wanted to play me. And when they started to play me, they always won. The strongest among the guards taught me how to control the center. After that, the guards had no chance to defeat me.
He just hopes that someday he'll be released. He's in what I would consider a horrible legal limbo, and it's just tragic. He needs to go home. If he gets out, he could come live with me. I'd be happy to have Mohamedou in my house. He's just such a good, warm, caring human being, and somehow that strength keeps him going.
What's remarkable about Mohamedou's book is that we have a voice that's come out of this void, and that it's such a remarkable, humane, and I think ultimately forgiving voice. It's a wonder.
Sadly, this has taken so long, but we have never and will never lose hope, never.
A Mauritanian folktale tells us about a rooster-phobe who would almost lose his mind whenever he encountered a rooster. "Why are you so afraid of the rooster?" the psychiatrist asks him. "The rooster thinks I'm corn." "You're not corn. You're a very big man. Nobody can mistake you for a tiny ear of corn," the psychiatrist said. "I know that, doctor, but the rooster doesn't." For years, I've been trying to convince the US government that I am not corn.
The actor Dominic West reading the diary of Guantanamo prisoner Mohamedou Ould-Slahi. That video was produced by The Guardian. When we come back, we'll be joined by Mohamedou Ould-Slahi's attorney, Nancy Hollander, the editor of the prison diary, the Guantanamo diary, Larry Sims, and Colonel Morris Davis, the former chief military prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay. Back in a minute. Rodrigo y Gabriela with a cover version of Metallica's Orion here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We continue to look at the case of Mohamedou Ould Slahi, a Mauritanian man who's been held at Guantanamo for 12 years without charge. His writings were published this week as the book Guantanamo Diary. Slahi's 466-page handwritten manuscript was initially classified by the U.S. government and heavily redacted before publication.
It was held for more than 7 years before it's been released. We're joined now by three guests. Nancy Hollander is Mohamedou Ould Slahi's lead lawyer. Larry Sims is editor of Guantanamo Diary. And Colonel Morris Davis is the former chief military prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay. He resigned in 2007, shortly after he met with Mohamedou Ould Slahi. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Colonel Morris Davis, talk about who Mohamedou was, how you met him there, and did your resignation have anything to do with him?
Yeah, I met him early in 2007 as we were preparing, the prosecution of the military commission cases at Guantanamo. We were interested in potentially finding a detainee or detainees that would be cooperating witnesses. And I was told that Slahi and his partner, Tariq al-Sawa, they lived in a compound of their own, that the two of them were candidates, potential candidates to cooperate with the prosecution. So I met with Mr. Slahi probably 3 or 4 times over a course of several months, and got to know him probably as well as any of the detainees that I had contact with at Guantanamo.
And what was your impression of him? How did he affect you?
Well, it was really an interesting contrast. He and Tariq Sawa lived together in a compound of their own. At the time, back in 2007, Guantanamo was supposed to be this super secret facility that you couldn't really talk about, but you could go on Google Earth, and if you knew what you were looking for, you could drill down and see their compound where they lived and their vegetable garden that was between their two huts where they lived. They were a sharp contrast. Mr. Slahi is maybe 5'6" and weighs about 110 pounds last time I saw him. And Mr. Sawa was probably 6 feet tall and weighed over 350 pounds. So just their physical appearance was like the odd couple, and personality-wise as well. Mr. Sawa was polite and would, if you ask him something, he would respond, but he didn't carry a conversation. Where with Mr. Slahi, the problem wasn't getting him to talk, it was getting him to stop, because he was very gregarious. As you can see from the diary, he's very articulate, very bright, and it was always a pleasure to meet with him. I mean, every time I went, I mentioned the article I wrote for The Guardian that every time I went, he had to make tea using mint leaf from the garden. And, Guantanamo was always hot and humid, and I was in uniform, and I'm not a tea drinker to begin with, but I'd have to sit and drink hot tea and, sweat in the sun and chat with Mr. Slahi.
And Nancy Hollander, you've been Slahi's legal representative since he's been allowed legal representation, that is, since 2005. Can you tell us how you came to work on this case and how it is that he's been held for 12 years and has yet to be charged with anything?
I came to work on this case because a lawyer in France, a lawyer named Emmanuel Altit, sent me an email saying that he had heard from a lawyer in Mauritania, Mr. Ribete, that the family of Mohamedou thought he was in Guantanamo, and that now that the prisoners could have lawyers, would I consider seeing if I could represent him. I found him. I found that he had been assigned to another lawyer by the Center for Constitutional Rights. That lawyer was Sylvia Royce. And although Sylvia left the team later on, at the beginning, the two of us made arrangements to go to Guantanamo. And our first visit was perhaps the one that sticks in my head the most. We went, it was our very first visit to Guantanamo for both of us. We walked into the hut, the guards opened the door, and there was Mohamedou, and he stood up and he smiled and he put his arms out as though to walk up to embrace us, but he didn't move. And we stood there for a moment, and then I realized, to my horror, that he was chained to the floor with chains around his ankle and couldn't move, so he could just stand there and smile. And we walked into his embrace, and he hugged us. I think we were the first people he had hugged in several years. And then he gave us these first 90 pages as a way for us to know about him, to know something about him and what had happened to him. And that's how this book began. And we encouraged him to keep writing, and then he continued to write.
Nancy
He's
Hollander,
never been charged with, I'm sorry.
You were saying he's never been charged with a crime. Nancy Hollander, can you describe what happened to him when the U.S. detained him, first before Guantanamo and then at Guantanamo? In Guantanamo Diary, Slahi's book, he says one of the interrogators said, quote, "I know I can go to hell for what I do to you."
Well, what that guard was referring to was specifically not letting him pray. One of the things that was on the list of special interrogation techniques that the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, approved specifically for Mohamedou was that he not be allowed to pray. He was also put in what they called their frequent flyer program, which meant he was not allowed to sleep. He was interrogated round the clock, and maybe he would get an hour or two of sleep, and then they would wake him up. So this went on for almost 2 months, or maybe even longer. They dragged him out on a boat. First, they came into his cell with a dog, terrified him, put a hood over him, put goggles on, put earmuffs on, dragged him. We were able to learn from his medical records that he complained that his ribs were broken, and in fact they were broken on that when they beat him. And they took him out, and he was, as he says in the book, afraid that they were going to dump him in the ocean or take him to some other place. For a long, long time, they did not tell him he was back in Guantanamo. They beat him, they terrified him, they put ice down his clothes, they kept him in cold rooms, then they kept him in hot rooms. They knew that he had a back issue from a previous injury, and that the doctor in Guantanamo had ordered that he not have to stay in certain positions, and they used that. And those were the positions they put him in, precisely what they knew he was not supposed to be in. The litany goes on and on of what they did to him.
But Nancy, even before Slahi got to Guantanamo, he had been detained for almost a year. He was picked up on his way from, I believe, from Canada to Mauritania. He was picked up in Senegal. Then he was detained in Mauritania, then sent to Jordan under the CIA's Extraordinary Rendition Program for 7.5 months. Then from there to Bagram, and from Bagram to Guantanamo. Can you describe what happened in the course of his going to Guantanamo?
Well, he was picked up twice. First in Senegal, when he left Montreal, he flew to Senegal, and that's where his family was going to meet him to drive home to Nouakchott in Mauritania. He was detained there. Then later he was detained again in Mauritania, and then finally he was at his mother's house, and this was the third time, and he got another call from the police station, then the police chief, and they said, "Would you come and talk to us, and bring your own car? We're sure you won't be staying long." And he never went back. They took him to Jordan. He was there for 7.5 or 8 months. He was interrogated there. He was not tortured in the same way, but he was put in a cell where he could hear other people screaming and crying, and was terrified every moment that he was there. And then suddenly another plane comes. He thinks he's going home, and in fact he ends up in Afghanistan for a couple of weeks and then goes to Guantanamo. And at that time, the government was claiming that it was taking people from the battlefield in Afghanistan, which of course wasn't true. Only about 5% of the people in Guantanamo were ever actually on a battlefield. But he came from Afghanistan in a harrowing airplane ride to Guantanamo and was interrogated as soon as he got there, and then was interrogated and tortured. And even after he agreed to tell them whatever they wanted to hear, they continued with their, what he called the recipe of torture.
I want to turn
But he was never charged, ever charged with any crime.
I want to turn to a comment from Slahi's brother, Yahid Old Slahi. He spoke to the BBC and said he was most upset with the Mauritanian government about what happened to his brother.
I think they sold him to the Americans, and they lied the whole time to us. They told us that Mohammed was still in prison in Mauritania while he was being tortured in Guantanamo Bay. I read the news in Der Spiegel magazine whilst I was at university in Germany, and I couldn't believe it. My mother had been taking money and food to the jail every day in Mauritania because they told her that Mohammed was in there. I called my family and I told them that my brother was actually in Guantanamo Bay, but they didn't believe me. They didn't believe me until 2002 when they got a letter from my brother from the prison in Guantanamo.
That is Yahid Old Slahi, the brother of Mohamedou, who is still in prison at Guantanamo over 12 years without charge. Colonel Morris Davis, you've referred to Slahi as a kind of Forrest Gump. What do you mean?
Well, as was mentioned earlier, he was went to Germany. He was in and around Hamburg. The Hamburg cell of al-Qaeda was affiliated with 9/11. You heard, I think Nancy mentioned that he was in Montreal, which was in and around Rassam and the Millennium bombing plot. So he turned up in places where there were significant events related to terrorism that were taking place, kind of like Forrest Gump. Anytime there's a historical event somewhere in the picture, you'd see him in the background. And Slahi was kind of the same way. He showed up at the right time in the right places. But when we were looking at him potentially being a cooperating witness, myself and some other members of the prosecution team went out to the National Counterterrorism Center with a group of other people, and we had a briefing from the agents that had spent years investigating Slahi's case. And we went through the whole litany of, where he'd shown up. But, their conclusion was that there was a lot of smoke and no fire, that, there are odd circumstances where he showed up in places, but there was absolutely no evidence that he had ever engaged in any acts of hostility towards the United States. And the conclusion was there was simply nothing that we could charge him with. And as you said, for more than a dozen years now, he's been sitting at Guantanamo. And one of the real ironies is there have been 6 men that have been convicted of war crimes at Guantanamo in the military commission. 5 of those 6 are back home in their home countries. So it's a sad commentary on America, where you're better being a convicted war criminal than someone who's never been charged at all.
And Colonel Morris Davis, could you explain how it is that Slahi was initially considered a high-value target, but then when it came to the point where an attempt was made to charge him or to prosecute him, as you point out, there wasn't sufficient evidence. Could you talk specifically about the role of Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Couch and his role in this?
Right. Yeah, I became the chief prosecutor in September of 2005. I was the 3rd chief prosecutor. They're currently up to the 6th chief prosecutor. But at the time I came on board, Lieutenant Colonel Couch had been a member of the prosecution team for a year or two before I got there. And one of the cases that he'd been assigned was the Slahi case. And after reviewing the evidence, he was convinced that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges, and he was also convinced that Slahi had been tortured. So for both reasons, he had concluded it was a case that couldn't be prosecuted. And when I came on board, he briefed me on the case, and I came to the same conclusion, and that was just reinforced later. As I said, when we got the briefing at the National Counterterrorism Center, and all of the agencies involved agreed that there just wasn't a case to be had against Slahi. But again, he showed up at places like Hamburg and Montreal where there were significant events, and I think that's what led to the suspicion that he had to be a high-value detainee, that he was in and around these places where significant events took place, and if only we could torture him and, he would spill the beans and we'd find bin Laden and everything would work out fine. And that just simply wasn't the case.
I mean, it's just astounding. You quit 8 years ago as the chief military prosecutor at Guantanamo, having decided not to bring charges against him. And he is still there, actually there for more than 12 years, which brings us to Larry Siems, who is the editor of this astonishing book called Guantanamo Diary. Sometimes we get on the air, we say book has just come out to rave reviews, it's a bestseller, and we interview the author. We cannot interview the author because he's at Guantanamo. but we can talk to you, who worked on the text. The cover of Guantanamo Diary, you see his handwriting behind it. It's in English. Where did Mohamedou learn English?
English is Mohamedou's fourth language. He, born in Nouakchott in Mauritania, he spoke Arabic and French. He studied in Germany, and so he was fluent in German. He learned English in U.S. captivity. This is a language that he learned from the United States, from his captors.
And Larry, on the back of the book, John le Carré describes this work as, quote, a vision of hell beyond Orwell, beyond Kafka. So could you explain how you first came across his writing and what made you decide to work on this text?
Sure. I actually came to Mohamedou's story through another set of documents entirely, which was the U.S. government's own documents. From 2009 to 2012, I worked with the ACLU on this project called the Torture Report. The ACLU had managed to excavate 100,000 pages of formerly classified government documents about the abuse of detainees in Guantanamo, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in the CIA black sites. But it was just raw data, and my job was to try to sort of go through that and find stories, weave together stories of individual characters, to find the human beings that were, involved in these documents. And one of the people that emerged most clearly was Mohamedou Ould Slahi, because Mohamedou, as we've said, was one of the most abused prisoners in Guantanamo. He was one of 2 prisoners designated for this special project interrogation by Defense Intelligence agents. That interrogation, the plan of which was signed, as Nancy said, by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld himself. That plan was written, revised meticulously. It involved everything that Nancy described: extreme isolation, sleep deprivation, cold rooms, loud music, strobe lights, death threats, ultimately a threat to his mother. They came to him, his chief interrogator came to him posing as a Navy captain who was an emissary from the White House, handing him a letter that said, "Mohamedou, we have your mother. We're bringing her to Guantanamo. She'll be the first woman in Guantanamo, and you can imagine what will happen to her in Guantanamo." All of those things were calculated and written out ahead of time in government documents, and then, of course, meticulously detailed, as torturers are perversely prone to do, in all of the daily reports from those interrogations. We had all those documents by 2008, 2009, mostly because of 2 large government investigations, one by the Justice Department that was prompted by FBI agents inside of Guantanamo complaining about the treatment that the Pentagon interrogators were starting to mete out in Guantanamo, patterned on the CIA's black site enhanced interrogations. And then from a Senate Armed Services Committee report. Both of those reports have many pages about Guantanamo, about Mohamedou's story. So I knew the broad outlines of it. I also had from those documents, little hints of his voice. And it's very, you realize how absolute the censorship is around Guantanamo. And one of those things is, part of the reason is to keep us from hearing those voices. But in those documents, there were 2 in particular that were transcripts from his hearings before review boards in Guantanamo. And one of them was from 2005, his administrative review board hearing. He's quite a humorous guy. He makes a couple of good jokes in there. And then he tells the presiding officer, he said, "Oh, by the way, I've written a book." They sent the book to Washington. It's classified, but it'll be cleared for release. And when it's cleared, you should read it. It's a really interesting book, I think. He says this in 2005. As Nancy said, it's held for 7 years. And then finally, after this process of of litigation and negotiation that Nancy's team carried out, in 2012, after I'd finished this torture report, I got a call from them saying, "We have this manuscript. Would you like to see it?" And I said, "Yes, please." And
you take it from there. How much of it was redacted? Was he able to see the final edited version?
There are about 2,600 black bar redactions in the book, varying from 1 word to many pages. I was not able to communicate with him. I sent him a letter at one point introducing myself and saying that I'd been asked to work on this, and I hoped we could correspond, and I never heard anything. I have no idea whether he received that letter. When I had finished my draft of an edit of the manuscript, I officially petitioned the Pentagon to be allowed to visit him just once, using, according to whatever security protocols they wanted, just so I could sit with him and sort of go through and make sure that he approved of the shape of the final manuscript, because I think it's a dead basic right, as Mohamedou would say, of any writer to have the final say about how his words appear in print. I, for years, worked as the free expression director at PEN American Center, and I'm above all a free expression advocate. So I thought he would have that right to do that. The Pentagon refused to allow me to visit him, citing, as they have done for every journalist and writer who's tried to visit a detainee, citing, quite ironically, the Geneva Convention's prohibition on making detainees into public curiosities. That was their basis for denying me the right to visit him.
Mohamedou's mother died in 2013. Nancy, can you talk about Mohamedou's reaction and what he tried to do to see his mother?
It was really tragic because we found out from his lawyer in Mauritania that his mother had died, and his family was really afraid to tell him that she had died. They were afraid of how he was very close to his mother. Of course, that's what the government knew, and that's why they came up with this fake letter in the beginning. And they were afraid to tell him. We actually had the responsibility of telling him. We arranged for a phone call. To arrange for a phone call from counsel, you have to have an emergency, and then it takes about 15 days to get the call. We were able to make a call to him. It was a call with someone from the government on the line, so it was not a privileged call, attorney-client privilege, but we actually told him about his mother. He was very upset. He was upset both, of course, that she had died and that his family had not told him. And they were so conflicted, they were so afraid that it would take him over the edge to know she had died. And as you can see, he dedicated this book to her, which I assumed he would want to do. And you know, it's really important to see that even though he wrote the book in 2005, if you read the little afterword, he wrote that in 2014 and gave it to another member of our team, Linda Moreno, when she went to visit him. And he's still a forgiving person. He still wants to sit down and have a cup of tea with the people who are mentioned in this book. It's so incredible that he is so compassionate even to this day, and I think that humanity in him is what keeps him going.
His relationship with his torturers, Larry. Joe Nocera of the New York Times Review of Books, in New York Times review of his book, said he comes across as fair to all, even to his torturers, and yet you've described him as one of the most abused prisoners at Guantanamo.
I think that's one of the most extraordinary things about this book. If you hear that you're going to read a diary by one of the most abused prisoners in Guantanamo, you're braced for a lot of darkness. No question about it. And the story that Mohamedou tells is very, very dark. But his personality is the opposite. He's an optimistic person. He's a curious person. He's constantly pulled out of himself by his surroundings, by the people he interacts with. He likes people. He has a fundamental ethic of treating everybody as an individual, no matter who they are or what team they're supposedly playing for. He says, you know, he understands human beings are made up of a combination of good and evil. Everybody is. It's just a question of what percentage, you know. And his interactions with, you know, the amazing thing about this book is how it gives us the human drama of Guantanamo, and it's a very, very human drama. And for me, I think the revelation of the book is that this is our drama as well, and the characters in this book are American servicemen and American servicewomen and intelligence officers whose voices we've never heard before, who are put in these positions, you know, and his portraits of our brothers and sisters and sons and daughters, you know, are remarkable. And you realize how, you know, how much we've put on them and how much they must be suffering for what we've asked them to do.
Well, let's go back to Mohamedou Slahi in his own words. This is the Oscar-winning British actor Colin Firth reading an excerpt from Guantanamo Diary.
So has the American democracy passed the test it was subjected to with the 2001 terrorist attacks? I leave this judgment to the reader. As I am writing this, though, The United States and its people are still facing the dilemma of the Cuban detainees. In the beginning, the US government was happy with its secret operations, since it thought it had managed to gather all the evils of the world in Gitmo and had circumvented US law and international treaties so that it could perform its revenge. But then it realized, after a lot of painful work, that it had gathered a bunch of non-combatants. Now the US government is stuck with the problem, but it is not willing to be forthcoming and disclose the truth about the whole operation. Everybody makes mistakes. I believe the US government owes it to the American people to tell them the truth about what is happening in Guantanamo. So far, I have personally cost the American taxpayer at least $1 million, and the counter is ticking higher every day. The other detainees are costing more or less the same. Under these circumstances, Americans need and have the right to know what the hell is going on. Many of my brothers here are losing their minds, especially the younger detainees, because of the conditions of detention. As I write these words, many brothers are hunger striking and are determined to carry on no matter what. I am very worried about these brothers I am helplessly watching, who are practically dying and who are sure to suffer irreparable damage even if they decide to eat. It is not the first time we have had a hunger strike. I personally participated in the hunger strike in September 2002, but the government did not seem to be impressed. And so the brothers keep striking for the same old and new reasons, and there seems to be no solution in the air. The government expects the US forces in Gitmo to pull magic solutions out of their sleeves. But the US forces in Gitmo understand the situation here more than any bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., and they know that the only solution is for the government to be forthcoming and release people. What do the American people think? I'm eager to know. I would like to believe the majority of Americans want to see justice done, and they are not interested in financing the detention of innocent people. I know there is a small extremist minority that believes that everybody in this Cuban prison is evil and that we are treated better than we deserve. But this opinion has no basis but ignorance. I am amazed that somebody can build such an incriminating opinion about people he or she doesn't even know.
That's Oscar-winning British actor Colin Firth reading an excerpt from Guantanamo Diary. I wanted to end with Nancy Hollander. In 2010, Nancy, the Washington Post wrote, Sawa, now 52, and Slahi, now 39, have become two of the most significant informants ever to be held at Guantanamo. Today, they're housed in a little fenced-in compound at the military prison where they live a life of relative privilege, gardening, writing, and painting, separated from other detainees in a cocoon designed to reward and protect. Can you explain that?
Well, I'm really not at liberty to talk about Mahamadou's living conditions. I can tell you that when he was tortured and when they finally brought him this fake letter from his mother, he said, I'll tell you anything you want. And then he told them anything they wanted to hear. But it was really information they fed him. You did this, didn't you? You did this, did you? We just need you to tell us that you did it. So he said, I did it. And it was all lies because he hadn't done any of it. He lives in Guantanamo in a prison cell every single day of his life. And since 2010, since the day that Judge Robertson ordered him to be released, he should have been released. And the government of the United States should stop fighting against that release and release him now.
And Nancy Hollander, before we conclude, very quickly, what seems to be at issue then? Is it the case that the U.S. government still says that he has maintained his links to al-Qaeda, whereas he says he has severed them? How is it that he is still detained years after a judge has said, a U.S. judge has said he should be released, or that there's nothing to charge him?
Well, you're correct that the government maintains that when he swore allegiance to fight in Afghanistan in 1990, which I might add the United States supported that fight financially and militarily, that was it. That he still maintains, the government still maintains that he's part of al-Qaeda, and the Court of Appeals have made the test so broad and so loose that it's almost impossible to fight against that. And the government keeps forcing that that standard to be looser and looser. So it's really the government, it's the Obama administration and the military that need to step up and stop fighting these habeas cases, particularly in Mohamedou's case, where the district judge found that in 2010, after he'd already been held for many years, the government had already gathered all the evidence it was ever going to gather, that it didn't have the evidence to even object to this habeas, which is a very low standard. So the government needs to step up and release him.
Last seconds, Larry Seams.
I mean, for me, the most disturbing question is, to what extent has he been held all this time simply that he's not able to tell the story of what happened to him? You know, the Guantanamo is a story about secrecy. It's created in secrecy. It was created in order to allow abuse to happen. Then it was perpetuated in order to cover up that those abuses have happened. It's being prolonged, I think, finally to prevent accountability for those abuses. And all that time we're perpetuating and prolonging grievous mistakes, and it needs to stop.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Larry Seams is the editor of Guantanamo Diary. We hope soon to be speaking with the author. He's Mohamedou Ould Slahi. Larry Seams is the former director of the Freedom to Write and International Programs at PEN American Center. Nancy Hollander, thanks so much for joining us. Mohamedou Ould Slahi's lead lawyer. And thank you so much to Colonel Morris Davis, retired Air Force colonel, former chief military prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay. He resigned in 2007, shortly after he met with Mohamedou Ould Slahi. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute with what some are calling the Guantanamo Bay in the Pacific. Stay with us. A song written for another longtime Guantanamo prisoner by British musician P.J. Harvey. Shakar Amar has been held since 2001 without trial or charge, despite being cleared for release by President Bush in 2007 and President Obama in 2009. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
A massive hunger strike is underway at what some are calling the Guantanamo Bay of the Pacific. The Manus Island Detention Centre is paid for by the Australian government and run by an Australian contractor, Transfield Services, but located offshore on Papua New Guinea's soil. The inmates are not accused of any crimes. They're asylum seekers from war-ravaged countries who are waiting indefinitely for their refugee status determinations. 80 detainees recently signed a letter to the Australian government saying, in part, quote, "Here, a disaster is about to happen. Please prevent this disaster." They're asking the United Nations to intervene against the Australian federal government's plan to resettle them in Papua New Guinea, where they say they could face persecution. Some have barricaded themselves behind the detention center's high wire fences. Others have resorted to increasingly drastic measures, such as drinking washing detergent, swallowing razor blades, and even sewing their mouths shut to protest their confinement.
For more, we're joined by two guests. Alex Kelly, a social justice filmmaker. On Wednesday, she organized a protest outside the Australian consulate here in New York City. And Jennifer Robinson is with us, an Australian human rights lawyer, director of legal advocacy for the Bertha Foundation, also co-founder of International Lawyers for West Papua. Alex and Jennifer, we welcome you to Democracy Now! Jennifer, explain why you were outside the Australian consulate last night and what's going on for what many in the United States may never have heard of in Manus Island.
The description that this is the Pacific's Guantanamo is apt. As an Australian, I feel a moral obligation to stand up and say, not in my name. The Australian government is indefinitely detaining asylum seekers, sending them to conditions that the UN has found to amount to inhuman and degrading treatment in breach of our international obligations. Consecutive Australian governments on both sides of the political divide have continued this practice, and it's time that Australians stand up and say, enough, this is enough.
But could you explain, what is the status of Manus Island? Why does Australia keep potential asylum seekers in detention there?
Australia intercepts people arriving by boat seeking asylum in Australia. They are insisting on their international right to seek asylum. Australia is concerned about the number of asylum seekers coming to Australia and is therefore intercepting them, sending them to PNG for process and resettlement there, so they'll never get to Australia. This is in clear breach of our international obligations.
Alex, explain who these asylum seekers are. How many are packed into this prison? What's their response in Australia?
There's over 1,000 people currently being detained at the Manus Island Detention Centre. We've got people there from Syria, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Somalia, and these people have been in there. Some people have been in there for up to 18 months. It's indefinite detention. They don't know when they're going to be processed. In fact, there's been no one that's been processed and resettled. So this latest protest is in response to the idea that they're going to be resettled in Papua New Guinea. Among some of the detainees, we know that there are people who are homosexual who've actually fled their home countries because of persecution, and now they're very frightened of being resettled in Papua New Guinea where homosexuality is illegal. There's been huge conflicts between PNG locals and detainees, and we're just seeing there's been ongoing violence, a huge number of incidents of self-harm, hunger striking.
How long are people held?
It's indefinite. In some detention centres in Australia, we have some other offshore and onshore detention centres. There's people who've been in there for up to 4 years.
And evidence of the hunger strike going on?
The hunger strike is still continuing. The Australian government is saying that the hunger strike is over, but we've been seeing images today, and I've had messages from advocates and people inside today saying it's continuing within the compounds.
And Alex, you mentioned the conflict between the locals, PNG locals, and the detainees. Could you explain what happened? There have been 2 detainees who've been killed or who died within that detention facility at Manus Island. What happened to Reza Barati, his name is?
Yes, there's been ongoing tensions since the detention centre was established. Manus Island, a lot of the community there are living in poverty, and it appears that there's been a lot of incitement of the tensions from people operating the centre, so spreading rumours within and without about the tensions. But last February there was a tragic incident where there was guards attacked detainees, and there was one detainee who died. We still haven't actually seen any prosecutions in response to the death of Reza Barati. There's been 2 people arrested, but there's allegations that Australians were involved.
Jennifer Robinson, you're an international human rights attorney. What's the law here? You've been to PNG, you've been to this area.
I've been to PNG and I've spent times in West Papuan refugee settlement camps, so I can speak with first-hand experience that PNG is not a state that is capable of accepting our asylum seekers and refugees. 90% of these people who come by boat to Australia have been determined to be refugees in the past. The conditions in PNG are terrible. It is unlawful for Australia to be continuing to send asylum seekers to conditions the UN has found to amount to inhuman and degrading treatment. We are in breach of our international obligations. The problem is enforcement. Australia's domestic law, the High Court of Australia, has continually found that offshore detention is permitted under the terms of Australian law. When we had the Malaysian solution under the Gillard government, it was challenged before the High Court and found to be inappropriate because we had a provision in our law that you couldn't send asylum seekers to a country that didn't meet certain human rights standards. In response to that, the Australian government amended that to remove that from our domestic law, which means we are no longer constrained, and they upheld the constitutionality of offshore processing. This is a clear breach of our international obligations, but what we can do as a matter of law within Australia's courts is limited.
But very quickly, Jennifer, what are the implications of the fact that this detention facility is run by an Australian company, a private contractor?
Seconds.
Australia is clearly liable, as is its corporation for the human rights obligations taking place.
Jennifer Robinson and Alex Kelly, thank you so much. That does it for our broadcast. Our website is democracynow.org. Special thanks to Dina Kester, Renee Feltz. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.